Okay, so slight change. Put the slash in front of GitHub to make sure it's not tacking this whole thing on. I think it just said push username onto history. Yeah, very true. Say what?
Every time I click the GitHub API, I look up a user, and then I submit it, the thing disappears completely.
Which thing? This thing?
The input and the GitHub logo.
And what, it doesn't say anything instead?
No, it just goes back to the home page.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about, so where we're at now. We know we successfully get this in the username, or in the URL. What we want to have happen, if I don't have anything here, is so if it's just /GitHub, I want to have this show up. But then if I do have anything after /GitHub, doesn't matter what it is, it could be a single letter, then that disappears, and instead, oh, there's a guy with the name Jay. That's cool. He's so popular, hanging out there in San Diego. Yeah. So, how do we get something to show up if it is an exact match of /GitHub, but then not show up if there's anything else after that? We mentioned in the presentation, but I know that was the first time you've heard it. Does anybody remember what we put on there? Exact, right? So we need a route in our GitHub component. And it looks like that route just shows up right below the form, right? So let's put a route here. And we know we want this to only show up when it is an exact match, right? So when the path is exactly /GitHub, then we want it to render this paragraph, right? Please enter a username to search on GitHub. So we've done that before. We just do a render method. And have that return some JSX. Don't forget your closing tag on your route. Oh, and the equal sign on render. And actually, for styling, I did it as an H3, not a P. Sorry. Please enter a username to search on GitHub. The H on GitHub? I don't know. Hopefully they're not angry if we're spelling it wrong. So let's test that out. Oh, what do we get? Route is not defined. Wait, why do we get that? We didn't import it. Import route from React Router DOM. Now that we did that, now let's test it out. So as you can see, currently we are at /GitHub/ something else, so it's not matching. We don't see that thing. If I take that part out, then we do see that thing. So that's exactly what we want, right? We only want this to show up when we haven't entered a username and submitted it. So that works, because as soon as I put anything in here and submit, that changes my URL. It's no longer an exact match, and that thing doesn't render anymore. So add route for exact match in GitHub component. Yeah. So that's when it does exactly match. And then when we add a username, we're going to want to match some other component, right? Because we want to render the actual like avatar and the username and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, exactly. So let's add another route, and when it matches that route that we're going to give it, which is /GitHub/something else, then we're going to render a different component. So just below our existing route, in this case it doesn't really matter if it's below or whatever, but I'm just going to put it below there. So when it matches /GitHub/what? We don't know what it's going to be, right? Just some param, some variable essentially that we could store that username in. So we can say :username.
Is that like what kind of syntax is that? Does that just mean anything after, or are we just using :username?
Yeah, so just saying when you're talking about a URL, if this is not an exact match, I'm just saying whatever is here, I'm going to assign to the param called username. Then that would be the syntax for that. So just : whatever. Yeah.
That's different functionality than backticks, right? Backticks would be inserting a specific thing. If you did like backtick /GitHub/ and then $sign inside, that'd be placing something in.
Right.
This way it's : whatever, so whatever's there is being pulled into something called username, right?
Yeah, essentially. Yeah, so it's kind of like backwards of string interpolation. String extrapolation, maybe? Yeah. And for right now, let's do another render, just so we can see that it switches from one to the other. And this will be fun. We have not had any of our renders accept props yet, but they're getting past props. It's just a matter of whether we want to use them or not. So let's pass the props into this one. And let's just have it say who we searched for. So we can say you searched for, and then remember the three props that router gives us: history, location, and match. Now the match prop is one that gives us information about what we matched on. So that's probably the one we're going to want to use, right? We need information. How did we match this? And then hopefully we can get that username out of it. So if we say props.match.params, we already know that username is a param. So we always get the match object anytime we're inside a router. Match has a params property, and any params that we have will be assigned to that. So we can say .username because that's what we called it. And then don't forget to close your route tag.
So is match an object that is like the URL or something?
So it's an object that's built based on what you matched on. So if I have a route and I tell it that this is the path I want to match on, then that match object that it makes and passes to whatever I'm rendering, the component or the render, it's going to give it that object, and that object has a bunch of properties on it, including like the actual URL path. And in this case, since we told it that this has a param, it knows, so it does its string extrapolation or whatever you want to call it, and attaches a username property on it.
Username, and then another set of colon, and then another colon, and then like page number or something.
Yeah, so if I did username /
And then page number would be considered a param of match.
yeah. So I could put as many params on here as I wanted, and it would just all put them as params on the match object. Yeah.
Can you show us the match?
Yes. So let's get this to work, and then we can inspect it in our React tools and see what it looks like. So we're over here. Oh, look, it already did it. Now if I am at just /GitHub, then we should render the other thing, which is just that paragraph, because we have an exact match for /GitHub. As soon as I search for anything, then it adds that here. We render the other component because now we match the other route. And our route specifically is rendering props.match.params.username. So it's getting this out of the URL and rendering it here. So if we inspect that, I don't think I can really search for it because it's not a named component. So let's figure that out. There's GitHub. This one, right? So there's match, params, username Davey. So I don't know, when I was first learning, it took me a while to get my head around params, but yeah, they work pretty much the same everywhere, regardless of what language you're using, because it's just kind of something that is with the browser. So yeah, just get used to it. It'll make sense eventually the more you use it.
Intuitively, I would think if you have another param after username, then that would be a param after username. It makes sense.
So yeah, that seems to be working the way we want, right? So that's good. And then as we mentioned, we probably don't want to do an inline render. We want to actually like have its own component, right? Because it gets pretty complex. Yeah.
Wait, so just to, so props are just like normal. That's just a React thing. And then so this the React router down thing that adds two props, the match thing.
Yep.
So that's a React router down specific thing. That's not a React thing, right?
Correct. That is React router. So remember how we wrapped the whole app in a router? And that's so all of the children get those three things: match, location, history. All right. Quick commit on that. Add route for GitHub user. All right, and let's add a new component. So a new file in our source folder. We will call it GitHub user probably. Makes sense, .js. Do our normal boilerplate for this, import React and component. Class GitHub user extends component. Export default. And a render method. For right now, just going to have it say something just so I know it worked. And then back in our GitHub component, we want to import the component we just made. So import GitHub user from /GitHub user. And then instead of doing an inline render, we're going to get rid of that. And tell it that we want to render a component instead. Component equals GitHub user. So again, just basic class, just rendering an H1 just to make sure it works. Make sure we export it. Import that into our GitHub user component. For the route that matches on /GitHub/username, we're going to render that component. And you can see that when our path is matching here, then we are rendering GitHub user. And when we are not matching, we should render the other one that matches on the exact path. So do quick commit, add GitHub user component. All right, so what do we actually want to have happen when this component loads? Like looking at our final product, what does this do when we load that?
Get specific information from their profile page.
Yeah, so it's getting information from GitHub, right? So it's taking whatever username we put in here and then querying the GitHub API for that information, and when it gets the information back, it renders it, right? So first step, we need to make that request, right? So let's go back to our GitHub user component. When do you think we should make that call to the GitHub API? Like immediately, right? Like when we make the thing. So like we could call it from the constructor. Don't forget to pass your constructor your props. And don't forget to call super, also with props. And then we're going to fetch user data, right? So let's just call a method called fetch user data. Which we have not made yet. But let's do that right now. So if we're going to fetch user data, what method do we use to fetch data? Fetch, right? We learned about that, and it's globally available, so I don't have to import anything. I can just say fetch. And we need to give it the URL that we want to fetch data from, right? So let's look at the GitHub API documentation. That seems promising. This describes the resources that make up the official GitHub REST API version 3. All requests to api.github.com. So we know that's going to be our base URL for all our requests. And then we are specifically looking for a single user, right? What is all the different stuff you can get from the GitHub API? Oh, look, a users tab. Oh, look, get a single user. So if we do a GET request to /users/username, again, params, see them everywhere. So we know we need the base URL plus /users/whatever username we're looking for. That should get us something that looks like this. So this is all the information that you get back. Login, ID, avatar URL, followers, following, all sorts of good stuff. So let's give that a shot. So we know that our URL is https://api.github.com. And then, so that's the base URL. And then we know we're also looking for /users/whatever username. So /users/ how do we access our username? How did we do it in the render method? Props, right? So we'll do some interpolation here. This dot props dot match dot params dot username, right? I know it seems very nested, but React DevTools, right? You can go inspect that at any time and drill down through the objects to find where it is, right? Yeah.
Do you not need an API key?
Eventually we will get rate limited, especially since we're all coming from the same IP address, but GitHub's is actually pretty high. So you could get an API key, so you could make more requests. So most APIs either require a specific key identifying you as you making the request, or they will give a purely public one, but limit the number of requests that you can make in a given time period. So GitHub's is fairly flexible, so I think we should be okay just using it without an API key. All right, so we're going to fetch this, and then what do we want to do with it? Well, we know we're going to get JSON back, right? So we're going to need to parse that. So fetch gives us a promise, so then we can say .then, whenever you get back to me, GitHub, give me that data, and parse it as JSON.
Is that data.json like a React thing?
No, so this is, fetch is entirely just something built into JavaScript. Yeah. So we are using it here, and we're learning it here for the first time, but we could have used this in our vanilla JavaScript applications as well. And some people did on their homework. So now we've got an actual JavaScript object. So we can say .then, and we made a request to an endpoint that should give us a single user. So again, we can call the parameter whatever we want, but we might as well call it a user because we know that's what we got. And for now, let's just console log it. Right? So make the fetch to this endpoint. And then, whenever we get the data back, parse it as JSON. And then take that user object that we just parsed and log it to the console. So let's see what happens. So we're back here. I'll search my username, look up GitHub user, and if you look in console, there we go. Console logged an object, and it looks very much like the one we saw in the documentation. So we got login, avatar URL, all the stuff that you would expect. So that's cool. We got the data. Should be able to render it, right? Let's do a quick commit. Make fetch request to get user from GitHub API. All right, so now let's actually render that user data. So instead of that h1, let's do a div, the class name of GitHub user. First thing we have on there is the avatar image, right? So let's say theoretically we store this object instead of console logging it, we just store it in state, right? So actually let's do that first. Instead of console logging, let's do a set state, right? And we're going to initialize our state here. We could do it outside the constructor, but since we have a constructor, we can just do it in here as well. And let's just say it's going to have a user, which is empty initially.
We technically, it's async, right? So like, should we put the set state before the fetch user?
Oh, it doesn't matter. All this stuff is going to run in the constructor, so it's all going to happen before it's actually rendered in the page.
I wasn't sure if we would reset user to like null or empty object.
No, I mean, there's no way for this to return before this happens. Although I do like just from an organizational standpoint that way. So yeah, let's just go ahead and do that. So he's saying, is there any way that if we call fetch.userData first, that it could return, set the state, and then we would overwrite it since this comes after it? Not really, but just from an organizational standpoint, I would like to do all the setup first and then any method calls that we have. So it would work fine, but we'll just reverse it for clarity. So then source, if we look at our thing, see we have avatar URL. So that would be this.state.user.avatar URL. And of course, we're going to be nice and put an alt, user avatar. Now, you'll notice we have a lot of information to put on the page, and it's going to get really tedious to put this.state.user a bunch of times, so let's make that a little shorter. We can use our destructuring assignment. Let's do so we're just going to grab user out of this.state. So that way we don't have to prefix everything with this.state. So we can just say user.avatar URL. Because saying we're making a new object, copying over the user property from this.state. More or less. That's not exactly right, but more or less. That's how I think about it. So we've got that. We can do the login, so that's like your actual username. We've also got the followers, which is going to be user.followers. We've got following. We've got location. And the last thing we had on there was a link to their actual user profile. So the href is going to be to the HTML_URL. We're going to say link to user.login profile. And then also, I noticed it wasn't doing this when I was trying it out, so let's put target equals underscore. Anybody know what that does? Yeah. Yeah. Hmm?
If it wasn't working before, I think it's underscore BLANK.
This will work fine. Yeah. Oh, I just forgot to put this in the other version. So yeah, if we say target is underscore, that means don't go there from this window. Open a new window and open the link there, or a new tab. All right, so quick run through of what we're doing. When we match the route, it runs the constructor. It initializes state with an empty user object. It runs fetch user data. Fetch user data calls the GitHub API with that username. Gets us the data, which we parse as JSON because we know it is JSON. Then that user object, we set state for the user to be that user object, rendering all of this stuff. So theoretically, that should work. And you can already see it does, even though it's not particularly styled. But it grabs all of that stuff for us. And we put a target of underscore on here, so now it opens in a new tab. That's lovely. Good. Nice. Let's go ahead and do the styling real quick so it looks a little bit prettier. So we're going to add Github User Dot Css. So just a couple quick rules. We want that image is way too big. So we're going to target GitHub user class, the image child of it, and give it a height of 200 pixels and a border radius of 50%. So height's pretty obvious. Border radius 50% just means make it into a circle. So if you want to change anything into a circle, you can just use that trick. And then any H3s in the GitHub user, we're just going to make dark gray instead of black. No changes yet. And why do I not see the changes yet? We didn't import it. Import GitHub User Dot Css. And now, ta-da! Let's see. Now Porter has friends. Let's look them up. Uh-oh. URL changed. But we didn't get any new information. Why? Because the code's wrong. Yes, the code is wrong. I mean, it's not wrong. It's just incomplete. When are we fetching data? At the beginning, right? In the constructor. So the component's already made. It's already constructed, right? So when we change the username, even though the props got updated, right? But it's already constructed, so it's not rerunning the fetch user data. So if we know the props changed because the match changed, how would we get it? Do you know of any lifecycle hooks, perhaps, that we could get to run again when the props change? Used it yesterday. Did mount would be after it got mounted the first time. It's already mounted. Will receive props, right? So we got that component will receive props, and it receives the argument of the next props that we're going to get. So that could be a good use case for that. But first, I'm going to commit the changes we just made. Render the user info and style it. All right. So we said we want to use component will receive props, which receives next props as an argument. 'twas a dark and stormy night. All right, so what are we looking for? We don't want to run every time the props change. We really only care when this changed, right? So like our location changed. Seems like a reasonable thing to check for. So how are we going to tell if the location changed? Does React Router perhaps give us a location? It does, right? Maps history or match history location. So we could say location changed equals if our next props.location does not equal this .props.location, right? So if the props we're getting have a different location than our current location, then we know that location changed. So this is just going to be what type of thing? Boolean, right? So it's either going to be true or false. And so we know if the location changed, then we want to do what? Fetch the user data, right? All right, let's see what happens. Oh, we got Porter now. That's nice. What happens when we try to switch back to me? Oh. What if I do it again? Oh, now we got it. Why do I have to do it twice? What's our fetch getting? It's getting this dot props, right? At the point where I'm calling this here, what is this dot props? Dot match dot params username. It's the current props, right? Not the next props that hasn't switched yet. So that's why I have to do it twice, because the first time this dot props is still the original name. The second time this dot props is now the one that I switched to. So like if I were to do Davey now, doesn't change, but now after it's changed, this dot props now is Davey. If I then go back to Porter, now it's going to get Davey's stuff, so it's always one behind, right? That is not Porter. So the problem is we need to be checking next props .match.params.username, right? Not this .props. This .props is still the old one. So what if we just change this method a little bit? We know we need some props, but sometimes we need this .props and sometimes we need next props. You could do that, or we could just explicitly pass the props in, right? Let's just do an argument of props. And then instead of this .props, we're just going to take the props object that we pass in. And in this case, we're passing in next props, right? But in this case, we are passing in the regular props, right? Does that make sense? So now, theoretically, currently got Porter. Look up me. Worked. Awesome. Try another one. Davey. Nice. Awesome. Hooray.